something beside me, a light to the kerosene, and the places aren't real anymore, and the faces don't say anything, in the silent light of the mind-blown sphere. It's a game, Devil's Chess Club. Devil's Chess Club.
Welcome to Devil's Chess Club. I'm Aaron Good. Today, Bryce Green and I are going to discuss the terror attack in Moscow, U.S. use of al-Qaeda during the Iraq War, the brazenly criminal Israeli attack on Iran's embassy in Syria, the Zionist push to ban TikTok, and the bizarre contradictions of the RFK 2024 campaign. This episode of Devil's Chess Club is available to everyone courtesy of Four Died Trying, the new documentary film series which explores the extraordinary lives and cataclysmic assassinations of JFK, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and RFK. There is now a Patreon page for Four Died Trying. It offers patrons a number of other perks, including a new Four Died Trying podcast and access to the newest film, Chapter 1, The World as It Was, which is also coming soon to other major streaming platforms. Bryce Green, great to be back with you.
It's good to be back, Aaron.
A lot of crazy shit has been happening in the world, and we're going to try to talk about some of it. And so let's just get right into it. First thing I want to talk about is the insane terror attack in Moscow. The 4 people were apprehended. We spoke a bit about it last week, but a little more details have come out, and it's not one I've been following super closely, but this, I think, is significant that the Washington Post reported on this. The headline is U.S. told Russia that Crocus City Hall was possible target of attack. In an unusual move, U.S. officials shared highly specific information about a terrorist plot with an adversary country. And specifically in the article they write, more than 2 weeks before terrorists staged a bloody attack in the suburbs of Moscow, the U.S. government told Russian officials that Crocus City Hall, a popular concert venue, was a potential target, according to U.S. officials familiar with the matter. Now, what is interesting about this is that the warning came around the same time that they fire Victoria Nuland, or she stepped down. People have speculated that, when she made all those disturbing, psychotic statements about Mr. Putin will find some nasty surprises on the battlefield. Okay, if you do remember that, like people were saying that this was, more foreshadowing of this kind of thing. And as dialed as she is into the heart of the neocon, hive mind or whatever we want to call it, it seems this whole thing seems very suspicious. So some people speculate that this was part of what she was calling for and was planning, and that perhaps people in Washington got wind of the fact that she and the Ukrainians had been coordinating some sort of terror attack in Moscow, and then tried to put the kibosh on it and warn Moscow. And then a couple weeks later, the Ukrainians and their jihadi allies, and all of which are, under the bigger CIA umbrella, perhaps they went rogue and did the attack anyway, or perhaps the Ukrainian side wanted it anyway, or who knows. But the attack happens, and it may have been something that Victoria Nuland planned and got fired for. That, to me, is the most interesting theory here that people have offered. But what do you think about this?
So there's a lot to unpack here with this attack. The Nuland stuff is interesting. Of course, we can't confirm it, but I mean the timing is strange. And Nuland is again one of the prime deep political actors working around the Biden administration. I mean, she's married to Kagan, who is one of the neocons that we think about when we say the word neocon. And we know that the U.S. has been working with networks to harass Russia in open terror. I mean, we know that the U.S. is running operations inside of Russia with the CIA. We know that was reported in oh, I think it was the Washington Post originally, but it's been picked up elsewhere. And we know that they were behind the murder of Daria Dugina, which was a terror attack within Moscow. We also know that the U.S. has an extensive history of utilizing terrorist groups for their own foreign policy ends. We know that they use the Chechen jihadis in the Caucasus to stir up trouble against Russia. They've admitted to that. We know they've used jihadis. You have the Mujahideen, you have the Yugoslav wars, and then you have Syria, and it's there's a direct line between the all of these jihadi insurgencies throughout the last 30 years and the United States hand of intelligence. Now, ISIS-K, I think we've talked about on this program, a bit, is specifically implicated in some of the U.S.'s designs in Central Eurasia. ISIS-K, of course, is supported by the East Turkestan Islamic movement, which is the Uyghur separatist movement that the U.S. has been openly supporting. Well, it's the armed wing of this Uyghur separatist movement that the U.S. is openly supporting. And that, of course, is used to hamper China's development in both Pakistan and Afghanistan, something that China, Pakistan, and Afghanistan all want to happen, but somehow these terrorists are getting in the way. So we have these networks in place in Russia. We have the use of ISIS-K and its affiliates in Central Europe, and we have the use of ISIS proper in Central Eurasia. Sorry, and we have the use of ISIS proper in places like Syria. So I think all signs point to the fact that the U.S. was behind it, and of course, ISIS-K carrying out an attack inside of Russia, like they can't do that without a state backer. They can't do that without someone who's providing the infrastructure, who's providing the money, providing the cover. That just doesn't make sense. These things, the well-planned attacks like this, don't happen without some sort of state backing. And the usual suspect when it comes to this, given that it's Moscow, given that ISIS-K took credit, and given that they were allegedly heading back to Ukraine, and given that the Ukrainians are even linking up with jihadi elements, the primary suspect is, of course, the Americans. And the Ukrainians, if they're implicated, simply implicates the Americans because, again, as a major, again, I think it was the New York Times or Washington Post, a major feature story described how the U.S. intelligence agencies basically built Ukraine's intelligence agencies from the ground up. So if it was Ukraine, it was the U.S. If it was ISIS-K, you should suspect the U.S. And the Newland angle is just the cherry on top of this whole thing.
Yeah, this is well, it gets into the bigger issue of what Russia has been facing since the end of the Cold War, and well, even really during the Cold War, the last 10 years of the Cold War were taken up in large part with the war in Afghanistan, which was the original super militarized mixed jihad operation that the U.S. launched to weaken Soviet influence in Central Asia and such. So you see all of these attacks around here starting in, I mean, I think the earliest one here that they have is 1996 on this list, Moscow bombing in June. The big one in 1999, which is the apartment, was it 1999 or 2000? Yeah, no, 2000 August. Yeah, 2000, 2000 August. The meeting
was 99. Yeah,
because we'll be talking about that. The meeting at Khashoggi's villa, but on the American Exception podcast, we'll start recording that soon. But that's a big one, and that stems from, as they say in this graphic here, I took this off of one of their articles at Strategic Culture. Moscow has been a major target for terrorists since mid-1990s. In most cases, the terrorist attacks were perpetrated by religiously motivated extremists from the Caucasus region, labeled by the Western mainstream media as freedom fighters. So this really gets into the jihad operations where the U.S. was backing these people in Chechnya, which Vladimir Putin mentioned to Oliver Stone in those interviews, a few years ago, and then which he mentioned again to Tucker Carlson. And I think maybe more people are starting to look back at that era. We're certainly going to revisit it on the podcast. So this is how they have sought to weaken Russia, is to, I think at one point they wanted to sort of co-opt Russia into this U.S.-led war on terror, thinking that these operations could be so destabilizing that Russia might even just become a client state in a sense. Like they might be able to freeze that relationship. But then I think Putin came in and instead wanted to quickly wipe out these jihadists and really break with the West and with the plan of being a client state of the West forever. And so I think this has been a big reason why they've been targeted the way that they have. It's quite remarkable to look at how they sync up the interests. And now you have the press secretary of Russia, even Maria Zakharova, saying like, ISIS is the U.S. and so on. And they're responsible for it. They control it. They always act in their interests. This is really the bigger issue is that what is this thing that we're looking at? And I call it the Parafascist International. I think it's especially the Parafascist Neocon International, or you could call it McJihad. The Parafascist Neocon part of it allows you to incorporate people like the Nazis in Ukraine and so on. I mean, it's really this project of the neocons in order to have the U.S. as the unassailable hegemon of the world to destabilize any place that might be a risk to the U.S. or might allow for a countervailing force to emerge. And that's what we have witnessed. So if it wasn't ISIS doing this, ISIS-K acting with Ukraine on behalf of the U.S., then it was at least the U.S.'s clandestine dark force, the Neocon Parafascist International. It was their networks that did it. And maybe they did it, maybe they went off script because the Ukrainians are so desperate or whatever. But I think it's pretty clear that these are networks that are maintained by the U.S. and are an arm of U.S. imperialism. And it's something really dark that the U.S. is going to have to answer for someday, I would hope.
All right. And another interesting aspect of this is that, those guys who were arrested and these ISIS-K people, and there was an analysis by Scott Ritter, who knows about these sorts of things. He said that they didn't appear to be genuinely radical Islamist terrorists. They appeared instead to be mercenaries. They were doing some hand signals wrong while reciting the Shahada, and they were planning on escaping rather than being martyred. Which indicated
that part is very suspicious that they were escaping to Ukraine.
Yeah, and it appears that they were mercenaries, and that the ISIS-K may have not been the primary, like ISIS-K, the central command structure such as it exists, may not have been behind the attack, but they might have claimed the attack. I mean, they've claimed attacks that they haven't done in the past, and Ritter suggests that. Given that they did, a lot of the ISIS branding, it was very easy for ISIS-K to take credit for it. And so this, again, indicates that this comes from these deeper networks. The McJihad is, of course, a subsidiary of this Parafascist International, which includes, the global oligarchy, corrupt networks, drug traffickers, neo-Nazi battalions, and their patrons. I mean, it's just the global network of control. But that's what this seems to be a part of. More information will come out, and I haven't had enough time to dive as deeply into this as I would have liked, especially given my interest in ISIS-K specifically. But that's just because there's so much other crazy stuff going on in the world.
Yeah, it is a deep a rabbit hole to go down. On a related note, we have a story from William Van Wagenen. I want to have him on the podcast at some point because he writes some interesting things about all these areas, some of the best stuff really at the cradle. And he has this article, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, Notorious Terrorist or American Agent. And he says that this petty criminal turned al-Qaeda leader in Iraq and U.S., poster child for Takfiri terrorism, served as a U.S. intelligence asset tasked with quelling Iraq's resistance to occupation and fanning sectarian hate for the benefit of both Tel Aviv and Washington. So here he's just going on and saying that, hey, all this Middle East plan is pretty much in accordance with Israel's stated objectives in the past. So let's pay attention to that. Now, I want to go over what he says here because people have forgotten this story, and it's actually pretty amazing. Ranked second only to bin Laden, the notorious declared enemy during the so-called war on terror was this guy, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, the founder of al-Qaeda in Iraq. He's a Jordanian. if you look at his life, it seems that there's a lot of reason to suspect he was a tool of U.S. intelligence, if there was any doubt about that. Neoconservatives in Bush's administration used Zarqawi to justify the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Okay, this was, they had said, oh, this guy is in Iraq right now. Do you see how dangerous it is? But he was actually in the Kurdish-controlled part of Iraq, and which is interesting because that's a place that the U.S. seems to hold sway. They had a no-fly zone there, and so this was very dubious of them to say this. But of course, everything about the Iraq War was lies, including the way they tortured people to get them to confess to al-Qaeda Iraq links, which were not there. I mean, that's really how much more sinister can it be? So he says in this article, Israel's plan unfolds in Iraq, and this is where the cradle is a good bit more ballsy than Westerners who write about this typically. He says a deliberate strategy of tension in Iraq advanced Tel Aviv's goal of perpetuating the country's vulnerabilities, dividing populations along sectarian lines, and weakening its army's ability to challenge Israel in the region. Now that is more in line with what Sam Huntington said about Iraq and why this is, relevant to understanding this era. Sam Huntington, The Clash of Civilizations, wrote, Iraq is the only country in the Middle East with the potential to challenge American hegemony because they actually have an agricultural base, thanks to those old river deltas that have had people there for millennia. And they have oil, and they have industry and infrastructure, social infrastructure, and so on, social systems, social services. That's what they had before the U.S. destroyed them all. So this was why the Israelis were obsessed with destroying Iraq. It's why they had Bill Clinton pressured him into signing the Iraq Liberation Act. Okay, it has long been known that CIA created al-Qaeda as part of its covert war on the Soviets in Afghanistan in the 80s and supported al-Qaeda in various wars, including Bosnia, Kosovo, and Chechnya in the 90s. Well, it has been known by some people, but very few people talk about it. I do. You know about it. Peter Del Scott and I and Ben Howard wrote articles about this. Nifiz Ahmed has written about it, but it hasn't really seeped in. And in the leftist discourse, very little talk about the 1990s and the support for all these al-Qaeda groups because it gets
zero.
Yeah, I mean, it's really something how the left is just so disinterested in the CIA and the clandestine state in general in certain areas. I mean, sometimes they like to talk about it, but it's generally kind of a sanitized way. And this stuff is just too much for them. And but this is really important. But I think the reason that they are not interested in this is that it's not that they don't want to say bad things about the U.S. because they do want to be critical about warmongering and capitalism and imperialism and so on. But it's just that I think that the 1990s McJihad stuff has such clear implications for 9/11 that leftists are just not comfortable with, and so their ideology, they don't want to know, they don't want to talk about it.
Also, a lot of them just don't. A lot of this information isn't hard to find. Like you said, there are only a few writers who have delved into this topic, in books, and a few more in some articles. But like you said, it's Peter Del Scott, Nafiz Ahmed. Those are the primary people that I've read about this period who've studied it in great depth. Who else? I mean, there's some scattered articles. There's some people who've dug up a lot of the stuff that Scott and Ahmed dug up, but I don't know who to go to as the expert on this. Maybe they're I don't know everything, but
well, there are there's the parapolitical book report genre of podcasting. They will talk about this is of course sort of what we're doing right now as we review these articles. But that's where you're more likely to find people distill it. It hasn't seeped into the consciousness of people who write about this stuff very often, and which is I guess that's the reason why you do all these covert operations, so that they're supposedly deniable. But how plausible is that?
I mean, you tell people that that the commanders of the KLA al-Qaeda division were in direct links with some of the NATO generals on the ground, and that's confirmed by relatively mainstream sources. They don't even know how to process that. They don't even know how to put it. There's no place in their worldview where that fits nicely. Well, they can just discard it. It's it's just a curiosity.
I think there's also the kind of chaos theory too. You could be like, oh, it's a war zone, and then shifting alliances and
crazy stuff happens.
Yeah,
it's the same thing when you see Jake Sullivan's Al-Qaeda on our side in Syria. It's like, oh well, there was a lot of stuff going on the ground, and who knows where those weapons were going. The U.S. was just trying to support the Democratic. It's You can always make some justification because of the fog of war or whatever, but that's why it doesn't seep into the consciousness. And
Yeah,
same with
he was
Salvador
national
Zakawi.
security. He was National Security Council. I would guess he was quite privy to a lot of these
Exactly.
goings on about that, because that's where that would get approved. The last part of this one section here, that is probably goes without saying, but it's worth repeating. Evidence points to CIA support for al-Qaeda affiliated groups during the clandestine war in Syria in 2011 amid the so-called Arab Spring. So of course, yes, don't forget about that. After 9/11 and after everything, we're back to supporting them. Now Zarqawi, his personal travels, he fought with the CIA-backed Mujahideen in the 80s in Afghanistan, went to Jordan, set up a local militant group called Jund al-Sham, and was imprisoned in 92. He gets released from prison following an amnesty, and he returns to Afghanistan in 1999. The Atlantic magazine notes he met Osama at the time, and I don't know, this is funny that they would write this. Osama suspected that Zarqawi's group had been infiltrated by Jordanian intelligence while in prison, which accounted for his early release. So this is funny and interesting because they reported that in Osama's library, you had all these things from like Michael Chossudovsky and Confessions of an Economic Hitman and William Blum and like 9/11 truth books and such. Like, I don't know what exactly to make of it, if they were lying about that list or what, but like when you see things like that, I get the sense that bin Laden had a sense of like the game that was afoot in some ways. I mean, I don't know that he was he seems to have functioned as a U.S. asset, but I really don't think, I think that he may have largely been sincere in what he was doing, and but also wasn't very involved operationally with things. It's very strange the way that he at points seems savvy about CIA chicanery
Yeah.
and the empire.
It would be interesting to see, because I noticed that there was no link for the claim that Bin Laden believed that Zarqawi had been infiltrated by Jordanian intelligence.
Yeah,
We should ask him about that because I mean that seems very interesting. To
he didn't put a hot link in it, but Atlantic may paywall these things. You know what I mean? They may paywall these things to where it's harder to get the exact link. But
Yeah, I'll
at
see if I
Reddit,
can find it sometime.
yeah, it'd be cool to find the article about it. Now Zarqawi goes to Afghanistan, right where he runs into bin Laden, and then from there he goes to the pro-Kurdistan region of northern Iraq and established a training camp. That's what I was talking about earlier when they tried to say that that al-Qaeda had links to Iraq. That was what the U.S. said, and they used as evidence of this the fact that Zarqawi was in Iraq, but it was in the pro-Kurd side, which is the U.S. dominated side, essentially, that had a no-fly zone and everything. So it was really very, very sinister to do this. But this kind of goes along with what the U.S. does in Syria. Why does the U.S. justify its presence in Syria? They say it's because ISIS is there. Okay, well, who put them there? Is the question. It's pretty wild. So the war in Iraq was quite strange when it got into this phase, because it really was a strategy of tension, and I think more has come out about it, and I think it's very well documented at this point, or much of it is, and yet the U.S. has never really had to answer for or explain the way it deployed basically strategy of tension terrorism to try to maneuver Iraq in a way that would be useful for it. So March 2004, suicide attacks at Shia holy places in Baghdad kill worshippers. Big car bombings in Basra kill that 250 involved altogether. And then al-Qaeda issues a statement saying, through Al Jazeera, strongly denying any involvement, but the U.S. side, led by Paul Bremer, insists that Zarqawi was involved. But al-Qaeda, the official organization, such as it is, denied this, which is interesting. So I think it had to have been the U.S. orchestrated these, or the U.S. etc., the neocon parafascist international, or just straight up U.S. military. Who knows? His alleged attacks on Iraq's Shia helped drive a wedge between the Sunni and Shia resistance to the U.S. occupation and sowed the seeds of a future sectarian war. That's what they did. There was a kind of bloody conflict in Iraq during this time period, and the U.S. I think wanted to do it. And by the way, just to get how crazy Joe Biden is, Joe Biden was the main person back in this time period who talked about partitioning Iraq. So I think that he has really been a neocon. I mean, everybody knows how pro-Israeli he is, but he's essentially a neocon plant in the White House. I mean, and even in the Democratic Party, even when he, you know, there was a time when he actually stands up against them, or he joins the coalition against the craziest people on the Bush side. He actually was against broadening the war in Iran. So I think that that's maybe Biden's secret to his success, is he has a foot in both the American nationalist side of the U.S. empire, which is pretty sinister in and of itself, and then there's the neocon, more pro-Israeli, Israel Uber Alles side, and he serves them as well. He did act to restrain them in 06, 07 when they wanted to go to Iran, which is interesting.
It's very interesting when you have these, the mainstream histories about the war in Iraq. And, they talk about this period of sectarian violence and how it's widely attributed to Paul Bremer and his policy of, disbanding the Iraqi army and all that stuff. And but the idea that and putting a minority in charge.
It's called incompetence, like they say.
Yeah, the idea that it's incompetence is, it's astounding, because like a 12-year-old could have told you that, oh yeah, this will start a war in the country if you have a bunch of military people with no military to join who hate the ruling regime. What do you think is going to happen? And of course, exactly what that 12-year-old would have told you would happen. It happened. And the U.S. seemed to be stoking it along. So many of these little things, like I didn't know that al-Qaeda was denying involvement through these things until I read this here. But so many of these little things get lost in history, and they don't color the broader picture. And so the dominant narrative is what gets told. And I assume you're going to have the same thing again with ISIS-K in Afghanistan. You're going to have the same thing with Gaza. It's just one of those maddening things to watch history being rewritten.
I mean, they'll do it for as long as they can get away with it. It would seem, and then they more has been documented and written about this too. It's wild. In a report written for U.S. SOCOM entitled, which is the Special Operations Command, Dividing Our Enemies, the author explains that the U.S. military used Zarqawi to exploit differences among its enemies in Fallujah and elsewhere. So he is saying, is he an American agent or not? Potentially he is acting as he's being exploited by them, but he's marching to his own sort of crazy script, but it's so predictable that he can be used. Or did he take some actual instructions from them? I'm agnostic about the whole thing, but either way, what I think this does establish is they used him as an asset to gin up this civil war in Iraq, so that the U.S. could divide and rule. That was the plan, although it hasn't really worked out that way. And they also used him to start the war in the first place by saying that he was an al-Qaeda asset in Iraq, when really he was in Kurdistan and was probably put there by, guided by forces he didn't know, or he was a witting asset.
That was during that anthrax speech, right?
It was, the case for the anthrax speech at the UN is famous because it was Colin Powell making all these dubious points at the UN in order to, try to get the UN on its side. But in general, they use these arguments over and over again. They leak things to the press about them. So it was really a longer period where these things were used. So I can't remember precisely if Zarqawi comes up in that speech, but because the anthrax thing is the main thing people remember, but he may well have. This report says, about this report on dividing our enemies that talks about Zarqawi. The U.S. military maintained a goal of fomenting enemy-on-enemy deadly encounters so that America's enemies eliminate each other, adding that when divisions were absent, American operators instigated them. So here we do have them essentially saying, admitting to false flag terror. I don't see how
it's just COINTELPRO
otherwise
for a whole country.
Yeah, it's COINTELPRO, except really ramped up in its magnitude, because you're talking about a place where lawlessness is broken down, and you're not trying to like provoke sentiment in the population. You're actually trying to provoke a war. So it's of course it's escalated, and we should just look at this and think about it, how they do this in our own country. I mean, it is they do use similar tactics at home, COINTELPRO, etc. Think of all of those different agents provocateurs and all these. I mean, January 6th seems to have used agents provocateurs. A lot of the Black Lives Matter protests and different protests that we've seen in the last few years, there are people there doing strange things that seem like provocateurs. This is just what they do, and this is even taken at another level. Now, this other aspect of the Zarqawi case, which is extremely disturbing, and I remember this at the time, and this was one of my first sort of forays into the darker side here during this time period, was looking at the Nick Berg thing, because there were things written about this, and then I looked more in 05 and 06 really deeply, and started to study, even before I worked for Obama, did a little bit of reading about 9/11 and some of these issues. So it made me more of an anti-imperialist, and it did make me think that there was a lot of conspiratorial chicanery going on. But this Nick Berg thing is crazy, and he also is from around here. I believe he's in from Montgomery County, in outside of Philadelphia, a suburb of Philadelphia. I used to live there in Montgomery County for a year or so, 2 years. Nick Berg, a U.S. contractor in Iraq, allegedly beheaded by Zarqawi. In May 2004, Western news outlets published a video showing Berg dressed in an orange Guantanamo-style jumpsuit being beheaded by a group of masked men. A masked man claiming to be Zarqawi stated in the video that Berg's killing was in response to the U.S. torture of detainees at Abu Ghraib. The prison, Syhurst exposes all of this. Berg was in Iraq trying to win reconstruction contracts and disappeared just days after he spent a month in U.S. detention in Mosul, where he was interrogated multiple times by the FBI. Now, he doesn't mention this in the story, but that was likely related to the fact that he had allowed one of the hijackers, the 9/11 hijackers, to like log into his computer or log into his email from his laptop or something like that. And it's very strange and never really explained. He goes to Iraq to be some sort of contractor and then ends up being beheaded. And it's like, oh, this nice boy just went to Iraq. But this is a very strange story. The U.S. claims that Zarqawi killed Berg are not credible. The Sydney Morning Herald reported at the time that there's evidence the beheading was staged and included footage from Berg's FBI interrogation, which is, I mean, inexplicable. The FBI, this is another one where I would like to see the link here, but if they don't have it online or it's paywalled, it's tricky. It was uploaded to the internet, not from Iraq, but from London, and remained online just long enough for CNN and Fox News to download it. So very strange. Uploaded from London and contained footage from his FBI interrogation. Like how could that? Is there any explanation for that? A general named Mark Kimmett also lied about Berg having been in U.S. military custody, claiming instead that he'd been held by the Iraqi police in Mosul. So why would he have lied about that? Why would he have known that that was something he should lie about? Or does he just lie reflexively? I mean, that does not seem like an accident or a mistake. Like, that's very strange. The video cemented in the minds of the American public that Zarqawi and al-Qaeda were major threats. Finally killed in an airstrike a few months later in June 2006. An Iraqi legislator said Zarqawi had the phone numbers of senior Iraqi officials stored in his cell phone at the time of his death, further showing Zarqawi was being used by elements within the U.S.-backed Iraqi government. That's wild. By the time of Zarqawi's death, the neocon agenda to divide and weaken Iraq through chaos and sectarian conflict had reached its pinnacle. Goal was exacerbated by the emergence of a new crazy group, ISIS, a successor to al-Qaeda, played an outsized role a few years later in destabilizing Syria, inflaming sectarianism there, and providing a justification for the renewal of a U.S. military mandate in Iraq. Yes, that's true. ISIS emerges right at the time that the U.S. is supposed to withdraw from Iraq. But then, we can't leave. How could we leave when these bad people are here? We need to stay and protect you. It's such an absurd protection racket that they are trying to establish in that country. So there we have it. I mean, more of this, the Zarqawi thing, which was written, a few weeks ago, but it's very relevant to what we're looking at in Moscow, and it just goes on.
Yeah. Again, this is one of those, all of these little details, they're reported in mainstream media sometimes, The Sydney, what is it, Sydney Morning Herald, was it?
Yeah.
If, yeah, and if they're reporting it, but it's not getting traction by historians or uh, chroniclers or even contemporary journalists, well, then it gets confined to the memory hole. And so then these assets can continue to be utilized without anyone scrutinizing or without anyone realizing what they should be looking for because the history is erased.
I mean, it's in it. The state secrecy means that you'll never. They may say things that allow us to understand that the official story makes no sense, and that the state is lying about this or that, or may have committed this or that crime. But state secrecy and national security will always be used to say you can't know it. You'll never know. I mean, this just happens time and again. Now, a less subtle way to deploy state violence is what Israel just did recently by attacking the Iranian embassy in Damascus, which is a violation of Vienna. I was going to call it Geneva, like Geneva. The Vienna Convention is the one that deals with the sacrosanctity of diplomatic missions in other countries. You're not to attack diplomats in this way. And it's actually Iranian, technically like Iranian sovereignty over so it's an attack on another state. Israel does it. They kill a high Iranian official, and there is nothing. There doesn't seem to be any consequences for it internationally, at least so far. I mean, this is just brazen gangsterism.
There are rumors about
the
Iran's
rules-based.
response.
The rules-based order is really just whatever the U.S. and its allies do is fine, and you got to accept it.
Yeah, I don't even know if journalists in America in the press corps asked the American officials questions about, oh, well, do you think this is illegal? I'd have to double check or ask someone who was there, but they don't typically ask about these strikes in Lebanon or in Syria or even in Jordan where they attack. Each of these are sovereign countries. Each of these are full members of the United Nations with all rights and responsibilities. But when the rule doesn't apply, when they don't want the rules to apply, then they don't, and that's what's happening here. I mean, imagine if Iran said that, oh, there's a dangerous person in Tel Aviv, like a dangerous Jordanian in Tel Aviv. Yeah, and imagine if they just decided to send a missile onto like the Saudi embassy in Tel Aviv. Like, well, how do you think the United States would react? How do you think the press corps would react? It would be a major scandal. But when essentially the same exact situation happens, you just replace the names of the countries. It doesn't matter. That's because, of course, and you know this, our listeners and viewers know this, but it's worth repeating, is the international rules-based order is just one where, America sets the rules and everyone has to obey. That's the nature of this order. There is no rules. There are no sacrosanct principles that are inviolable because they don't have principles.
No, there's really one principle, and it is that what the U.S. does is good and righteous. Okay, which is essentially it's almost exactly taking the Führer principle of our the West's one of the West's ultimate leaders in a bad way, Adolf Hitler. The Führer principle. I mean, it's just applying it to international relations and then giving it a euphemism, which is like a cover story. So it's actually perfect in that way because the U.S. hegemony is just a euphemism for imperial fascism over the world, top-down rule by an oligarchy, an imperial oligarchy. And so the fact that you're going to have you're going to have the Führer principle, but you're not going to call it that, it's the perfect thing. Now, a bigger question is, or at least one that's more immediate about this is, why does Israel do this? And I think that this makes the most sense. Political analyst Amal Saad, this is from the Cradle write-up on this, observed that Israel's killing of a very senior IRGC commander in Syria, along with others inside the Iranian consulate, appears less about employing the madman theory to intimidate and deter adversaries, more about deliberately embracing a strategy of chaotic warfare to escalate and expand the scope of the conflict so that the U.S. will be forced to directly enter the war. It seems to be a provocation, hoping for a Hail Mary to get the U.S. into a war, which would be so catastrophic and could potentially end the world. This should make Americans or any human being extremely angry. Israel is doing things for no rational, tactical, political gain. They want a bigger war, which could easily spiral into nuclear war and could kill all of us. They are that hell bent on this insane greater Israel pipe dream, this fascist pipe dream, blood and soil fascism. It's totally insane. And with the Gaza genocide and events like this, it's harder to argue against. It's basically impossible to honestly argue against the notion that this is an insane and extremely dangerous political formation.
Right. It seems to be a version of the Samson option in slow motion. Rather than firing off a nuke into some country and sparking a war, they seem to be trying to do these mini provocations all around the region, in Lebanon and against Iran, against Syria. And the goal, and U.S. officials have said this to Western press repeatedly, that they're worried that Israel is trying to, as you said, spark a larger war. Because if they spark a larger war, not only does that get the U.S. directly involved in the region more than it already is, but it also takes a lot of international attention off of Gaza, which will give them a freer hand to do what they want to do. And we know what they want to do. We know what they're doing. They're starving the population. They're massacring the population, designating areas free fire zones or kill zones. Free fire zones is what the Americans called it in Vietnam, but it's the same concept. And, they're just bombing the place to the ground. They're getting a lot of bad press, but it'll be a lot easier to deflect that press if they can sell it to the world and the public that they're once again fighting all these crazy Arabs to secure democracy for the world. It'll be a public relations coup. Fighting the terrorists.
Yeah, and now, of course, it's not working out this way. And I think if they would be very unlucky themselves if they were to succeed, because I think what would happen was you would end up with a war that might kill the whole world, but there's a very high likelihood that you would end up with Israel looking about like Gaza does now, because Hamas and Iran have a lot of conventional arms that can destroy Iranian cities. I mean, this is extremely stupid. So the Israelis, with the fact that they've put their murderous id on blast all over the world, and we all see it now for what it is, and they're never really going to be able to undo this, I don't believe. But the response is just perfect. They're just, let's exploit the corruption of the U.S. Political system and use our power and the money that we have to get TikTok banned. I mean, Kit Clarenberg has written about this, and that Kit's work is good because he's been banned from social media with no explanation whatsoever. That's the ultimate tribute that the establishment, the empire, the deep state can pay you, really, is to kick you off of social media. It says that you're reaching people and that you're making them take off the liberal mask of like free speech, democracy, all this.
You're telling me Elon doesn't care about free speech?
I think that he may on principle not like things like this, but I think that the issue with every one of these platforms, because they are media monopolies, it means that the state owns them in a sense, because all the state has to do is say, we're going to break you up if you don't do what we say. We're going to have a little antitrust investigation. They can kill them at any point. So even trying to determine if like Elon Musk was really ordered to do this or not, he can be given an offer that he can't refuse in a number of ways. So I don't think it's going to be fruitful to obsess over, the extent of Elon's hypocrisy. I don't care. I'm not going to make any pro-Elon argument. Yeah. I don't care. It's overdetermined that these social media companies are going to be wards of the state in a sense, because the state can tell them what to do. Yeah. And so I'm not going to go over this in depth. I just wanted to mention that this is the response, and you should really think about what it shows. In November 2023, a leaked recording of John Greenblatt, CEO of the Anti-Defamation League, so-called, appeared online. In it, he despaired over how much sympathy for the Palestinian struggle was apparent online in the wake of October 7's Al-Aqsa flood and the inevitably disproportionate Israeli response. Expressing shock at how terms such as Zionist entity, a delegitimizing characterization applied to Israel, had proliferated, he singled out a particular social media app and demographic as responsible. We have a major generational problem. I'm sorry, a major generational problem. All the polling I've seen, ADL's polling, ICC's polling, independent polling, suggests the issue of U.S. support for Israel is not left and right. It is young and old. We really have a TikTok problem, a Gen Z problem. So the issue here is that people on TikTok, kids and such, younger people, are seeing images that are so horrific that they can't even they can't explain them or understand them, and they're actually learning about Israel and Zionism and its history and its origins, and they're learning about what a kind of crazy and very singularly insane political entity it is in the world. So people say Zionist entity, which sounds kind of weird if you listen to it, but the reason that people will talk more about Zionism and so on is there's more of a recognition that like the whole Israel thing is like a branding PR thing that's really diabolical, and the project itself is genocidal, but then you're taking scripture and talking about Judea and Samaria and acting as though God has like promised you this and that, which is insane on its face. And so people talk more about Zionism now, and there's more discussion about the distinction between Zionism and Judaism. And then the more people understand that, the more people are thinking, well, hell no, I don't support Zionism because that's insane, because it is insane. And we're seeing it now. It's insane and murderous. And perhaps it's irreformable. I tend to think that it is, but it definitely is an abomination at this point. And it really doesn't have anything to do with Judaism and Jews as individuals, because all people are people. Like, this is not a characteristic. We didn't, after, Nazi Germany shows that regular people can be swept into insane political formations, and that's what we've seen. And their response is, well, like, let's just get rid of TikTok, because what is TikTok doing? Why do they hate TikTok? Because TikTok allows people to tell the truth in bite-sized portions, and they don't want people to know the truth.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. And, it's this idea that once you remove the gatekeepers and you give too much information to the public, people are going to have critical views of the state that wouldn't have been as prevalent if, the major media organizations like, New York Times and CNN and CBS were the dominant modes of cultural conversation. And I don't say this in defense of TikTok. I'm very much in favor of banning TikTok and a lot of other stuff. But the reason that they're trying to ban it now is to continue the new Cold War against China. Fear mongering, this idea that China's spying on our children and manipulating their brains and thought patterns. Just Red Scare nonsense. But also this information thing. Congress people were talking about this during the debates on banning TikTok. They were talking about how important it is to make sure that young people aren't getting fed anti-American sentiment. It's simple as that. And it's very logical for them not to want it, but we'll see how this turns out. Chuck Schumer doesn't seem to want to move forward with the TikTok ban bill, which indicates to me that it probably won't happen, or at least as written right now. But
That's
again,
a good sign.
But the TikTok ban bill was never about banning TikTok solely. It gives the ability for the president to designate whichever website, app, or service that is anything that he wants to designate it as dangerous or hostile, and then take steps to remove that from, or to take steps to penalize people who platform those apps and websites. So it's a roundabout way of banning, but the infrastructure is there. It's similar to the way the Patriot Act gave broad powers to the state for a single case, but of course they were designed to be used in multiple cases.
Yeah, the TikTok problem, I think, is even though they do bow to what the national security state says about certain things, they do not allow. I don't think that I don't think they give them the full control over the algorithm and then allow it to be totally kept in secret. Like I think that's part of the issue of why they have such a problem with TikTok and why its Chinese ownership actually is a problem. It's a problem because, to an extent that we cannot know, I believe that the Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, obviously Facebook and Instagram, but I think all the YouTube and Twitter algorithms also, like, I think that they are all done to like tweak certain things so that certain perspectives are just not going to be promoted widely and others are. And whereas I think TikTok, because they will not let them have like secret control of the algorithm, that they are not able to tweak it that way, which I think is part of why TikTok has been the biggest, the most significant venue for for pro-Palestinian, Palestinian human rights advocacy, basically, let's call it. Because I think that even though they can censor this and that person, I think that they don't like the fact that they know that a company is getting a record of what they want to censor, that is like potentially going to make it transparent, because it's ultimately in the hands of the Chinese, and that they can't control the algorithm. I think that is a big issue with TikTok, and I think it's why TikTok has been successful in part. Not that the medium perhaps might be useful and appealing to young people, but I think a big part of it must be the fact that they just don't have full and secretive control over what TikTok does.
Yeah, I think that's the case. Even though TikTok is staffed with, the American version of TikTok is staffed with a lot of these, spooks and spies, former NATO people. If you don't control if you don't have executive power, basically, of life and death over a company, then it makes it a lot harder for you to implement the sort of things that Snowden told us that the American government was implementing in these other platforms.
Yeah, and worse things. I mean, I think like even
and worse things, yeah, far worse.
Snowden's dealt with surveillance and such. I don't think he dealt with the algorithmic censorship, which is really what we have here. It's a disguised system of censorship, essentially, where if you're not putting out perspectives that are at least compatible or useful to them in some way, I think that they really do everything possible to limit your reach. It's a totalitarian system. And this brings us to the last thing that I wanted to discuss today. And so that people may or may not appreciate the graphics here. They're interesting to me for sociological reasons. So our friend Rob Skvarla said on, I think it was on Twitter the other day, something to the effect, it would be good to have someone inside the RFK campaign, because this is one of the strangest political campaigns in history, perhaps. He says something to this effect. And I, too, have been thinking about this more. And I said on the last episode that that part of what the issue is with RFK Jr. is that he's schizophrenic. And I think the tripartite state model is partly a way to make sense of what the hell he is doing. So the big issue that people like me would have with Kennedy, and the disagreements are his support for capitalism and his support for Zionism. In my formulation, the issue with the problems in the U.S. stem from oligarchy and a lawless sort of top-down regime that really isn't democratic at all. Okay, Kennedy, in its broad strokes, basically affirms that critique. He's pointing to widespread corruption and a top-down, imperialist, globe-dominating foreign policy. But then he soft pedals capitalism, or he praises these like different, modern robber baron dudes like Elon Musk and so on, or he's friendly with Bill Ackman, who's a very despicable fellow, right? And he just talks about the dynamism of entrepreneurial enterprises and so on. It's like really annoying and irritating if you are on the political left. And also, everything he says about Israel is like utter nonsense, and is a big albatross around his neck, even though I don't think he's that much different. I think he actually is a good chance he's better than Biden, although it's all academic. His rhetoric is terrible on Israel. And ultimately, this is why I left the super PAC, because I just couldn't handle the Zionism. It seems to be such an obvious moral issue at this time that you cannot rope-a-dope Israel just to gain office. It's not morally defensible at this point. And so I was hoping he would reverse himself on this, and he never did. And so that was that. So this is not me trying to advocate for his candidacy, because I think that morally you cannot do that as he is taking these positions on Israel that he is taking. But my bigger point stands as to what he is actually trying to do. I think that he is halfway talking about reforming democracy and restoring the Bill of Rights, and stopping the trend towards more Orwellian totalitarianism, and things like a cashless society where everything is centrally managed by, digital currencies and so on. And there's all this internet surveillance and social media censorship. Like he is, and that we have these endless wars and overthrows. So he's advocating for many good things on the whole, but he's still, Zion is okay. He's trying to have he has a modus vivendi, or even really panders to Zionists, and has a modus vivendi with capitalists for sure. And I think that it's because this is not a democratic regime. So his pure being articulating a fully democratic critique and running that kind of campaign, by his estimation, would be a failure. And so he accommodates the oligarchy. He seems to he's advocating for overhauling the deep state regime and putting in a more democratic system through reform and truth and reconciliation and so on. But he's also trying to do that while at the same time placating the oligarchy and assuring them that he's not coming for them. Because in reality, the foreign policy is the product of neocons, a crazy neocon Zionist strain that partnered with other belligerent factions of the U.S. and created the neoconservative consensus that is insane and has us on the brink of nuclear war, with Ukraine and all of Israel's misadventures in the Middle East and what U.S. has done there as well. This is insane. And so he is saying we should overhaul these, but, Zionism is great and capitalism is also great. When capitalism is the domestic source of our problems, it also drives imperialism. But just the oligarchy of capitalist wealth is what has corrupted all these regulatory agencies when he talks about the epidemic of chronic illness in the country, and corrupted every other part of the government that's supposed to protect the population from predatory behavior from corporate power and other harmful interests in the United States. So he wants to reform it, but he's basically saying to the oligarchy, I'm not coming for you. We need reform and I'm not coming for you. I'm going to save you. It's a bizarro attempt to do what FDR tried to do, I think. And I think that's why he's doing what he's doing. I think that's the logic that they are using and that we see at play here. And that's why his campaign is quite schizophrenic and very unsatisfactory to people on the left, or really anybody who is anti-genocide at this point.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about how I feel about RFK. I think the different approaches that or the different lines that he's taking, the different things that he's saying, are completely incompatible and incoherent. And when his campaign started, I was a little interested because he was saying a lot of interesting things that I cared about. But as it gone on, and you look more into what he said and what he's written, for me at least, it doesn't seem that there was any sort of serious chance at him seriously trying to win, and if he was, then it didn't have a serious critique of the system that he was fighting against. So I don't personally think that it's worth paying too much attention to anymore, because he's not going to win and he's not going to help the left much. So what else is there?
I don't know that he is certain to lose. I think he has some chance in 2024 based on Biden and Trump, who are so catastrophically bad. I'm not predicting that he will win. I don't think he has a good chance, but I think he has a chance, but we'll see how that goes. And I think that the 2028, it could potentially be that he would have a chance then, perhaps, because if the U.S. proceeds with either Trump or Biden, 2028 is going to be worse in many ways than 2024 will be. And at some point, the question is going to arise, what is going to replace and supersede the hellish U.S. empire? What is it? What would it possibly look like, a post-unipolar world? Even though we are in the post-unipolar world, the U.S. doesn't admit it. And so the rest of the world is trying to figure out how to deal with the U.S., who has delusions of grandeur and still thinks that it rules the world, but needs to be listened to because it has a certain economic impact and also has a nuclear doomsday machine. But I think that eventually this regime in the era of Western imperialism, now supervised by the U.S., is going to come to an end. And what kind of regime, what kind of system are we going to have in the United States as a result of this? And what kind of political movements are going to emerge to to take the initiative with this transformation. And I fear that if the establishment breaks down, the balance of power, when the status quo is no longer holding, is not in favor of the left. And so I don't even know I wonder what the left even thinks it's doing in the United States. I don't know what to do either. So I think this is a problem for us. Can we possibly move us in at least pro-democracy, rule of law way? If not, since socialism does not seem to be viable in the United States in any way, would reforming democratic institutions in a post-imperial world be the way to eventually, have the possibility for a move towards socialism, or are we headed towards fascist technocracy of some kind?
Yeah, well, we'll see.
We will see. And with that, I think that's really all that we have for this week. David Talbot may be back with us next week, but Bryce Green, thank you for being here today. It was good to talk to you again.
Yeah, good to be back.
Thanks to Dana Chavarria for producing this episode, and thank you for tuning in. You can buy or rent The Four Died Trying Prologue now on Amazon and other streaming platforms. Chapter 1 is also available now. Visit fourdiedtrying.com for details and check out the Patreon page. Please do subscribe to the American Exception podcast on Patreon for first access to all Devil's Chess Club episodes and for all new and past episodes of the American Exception podcast, including new episodes of our Peter Dale Scott Oral History series. I hope people find my analysis of RFK Jr.'s strange and contradictory presidential candidacy helpful. He is making freedom, democracy, and prosperity the rhetorical center of his campaign, but he also accommodates those oligarchic forces which by and large control the U.S. regime, basically capitalism and Zionism. In other words, I believe that the reason his campaign is so maddeningly convoluted is that while he is engaging with what is left of the American democratic state, he is also trying to persuade a sufficient portion of the oligarchy to accept his reformist plan vis-a-vis the current deep state regime, a system that has essentially been designed and managed to serve the U.S. oligarchy of corporate wealth. I personally think that after October 2023, accommodating Zionism is no longer morally defensible, setting aside the question of whether it ever was in the first place. This is a strange thing to watch. How much can one justify compromising just to have a slim chance to prevail on the devil's chessboard?